I would like to now introduce our speaker for today. For those of you who don't know Scott Higgins, he is a research scientist at the International Institute for Sustainable Development Experimental Lakes area. And that's a whole ecosystem research program that's based in Northwestern Ontario that focuses on finding solutions to water quality problems. And his primary research interests focus on algal ecology, aquatic invasive species, and climate change impacts. And he's participated in large collaborative projects on lake eutrophication, fish productivity, water diversion, climate change, and contaminants like nanosilver, diluted bitumen, and microplastics pollution. So today, Scott's going to discuss his research on regional climate change and its effects on freshwater ecosystems. So take it away, Scott, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Let's see if we can advance a slide here. That's the first test. Uh-oh, there we go. Okay, thank you so much. So thank you so much for attending. It's a real pleasure to be here. And with COP26 going on this week and last week, it seems quite appropriate that we're talking about climate today. And we're going to bring it home, and we're going to talk about climate change that's happening right here in Northwestern Ontario and what it means for our lakes and rivers. And to do that, we're going to be using some insights from the long-term monitoring program at the IISD Experimental Lakes area. So climate, where are we going? So every 5 or 6 years, the International Panel for Climate Change produces a report that addresses this question: where's the climate going? And the figure that you see is from the 2014 report. Now there's a new draft report that's out right now, but the story that it's providing is very much the same. The world is getting warmer. And how much warmer it's going to get in the future really depends on how much carbon, CO2 and methane that we're putting into our atmosphere. You've probably seen or heard of these two different scenarios, the representative concentration pathways, which sort of bookend how much carbon we're likely to put into the atmosphere and what our future is going to look like. On the left-hand side of your screen, the RCP 2.6 scenario is really if we cut our CO2 emissions dramatically and we essentially don't have any net increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. And the 8.5 scenario on your right is what happens more if we don't do anything and CO2 keeps increasing in the atmosphere quite quickly. And it's unfortunate, but that is the scenario that we are closer to at the moment. And so, of course, we need very strong commitments from governments and everyone around the world to try to drive that RCP pathway towards the image we see on the left. But that's not where we are right now. So from a global perspective, the air temperature is expected to increase from about 1 to 4 degrees over the next 50 to 100 years, depending on which climate scenario we're talking about. So the 4 degrees is the 8.5 scenario. If we look at the downscaled regional projections for Northwestern Ontario, they indicate about a 1.7 to 3 degree increase, but that's by 2050. And, you know, that's only 30 years from now. So it's very, very rapid. And that's because of our latitude. And if you look at the image on your right, you'll see that the further or the closer you get to the poles, the hotter it's going to get. And because of our north temperate latitude, we're going to warm a lot faster than the global average. I think it's important to know, though, that climate change isn't about just air temperature. It's about other things too. And one of the really important ones is changes in rainfall and snowfall. So overall changes in precipitation. And there is a lot more uncertainty in terms of the projections for precipitation. And on the image that you see on your left, anywhere that you see a diagonal hatch mark, the climate models don't agree, essentially, and that means there's a lot of uncertainty. And under that 2.6 scenario, almost the whole globe is covered in this uncertainty. We're just not sure. However, as we move to the 8.5 scenario, some things are becoming, the models are starting to converge and agree on a number of points. And basically what it's saying is that in many places in the world, it's going to get wetter. And there are places where it's going to get drier too. But their seasonality is also important. So where we are, we expect wetter springs and drier summers. And there's a bit of a split in Canada in terms of the east and the west. And so if you're west of Winnipeg on the prairies, it's expected to get drier over time. But if you're to the east, where we are, it's expected to get wetter over time. So those are the projections. They're the best estimates of the climate models that our atmospheric scientists are using to project how much carbon is going to be in the atmosphere. But I think it's important to note that, that these are projections, and this is what is expected to happen into the future. And it's based on a number of models, and it's based on the best estimates that climate scientists have. But there's a number of issues that come with those projections. And one, you can get continuous projections, but it's often really difficult to do so. So they tend to be, the average of over a 10-year span. So it's comparing, let's say 2050 to 2060 compared to the 1980s or something like this. So this makes it a challenge for trying to understand how climate is going to affect lakes and rivers. It's much more helpful to have a continuous climate data set. And then projecting to all of the effects on ecological conditions remains really challenging because ecosystems are very complex in themselves. So on the flip side of projections, there are trends. And trends are something that's already happened. They've happened in the past. And it's not just trends in climate, but we can also look at trends in how our ecosystems have responded to that climate. And so we can make this connection, and we can look at the relationships between climate and their effects on our lakes and rivers. And that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to look at the long-term data set that's been collected at the IISD experimental lakes area, where I'm really fortunate to work. And the IISD experimental lakes area, or I'll just call it ELA, is located just to the east of Lake of the Woods in Kenora. And we're about 30 kilometers down a logging road, and it's a very pristine area of boreal forest. So in the picture here, you can see our research facility. It's not very large, and it doesn't have a very large imprint on the lakes. But as you look around to the other lakes and watersheds, you can see that there's absolutely no development in the region. And here's another image of some of our lakes that we study. And again, you see these are intact boreal forests with no shoreline development. And the other important thing to know is there's very little pressure on these lakes in terms of fishing pressure or any other sort of development pressure. So most of the effects of what's happening on these lakes come from what's happening in the weather and the climate. And this is really important because when you're trying to understand the effects of something like climate change, there's a problem, what we call the problem of multiple stressors, and that it is actually quite difficult to find lakes and rivers in places where there aren't effects by something else, whether it's agriculture or urban areas or industrial activities or fishing pressure. Most lakes and rivers where people are located have multiple stressors. So it's really difficult to tease out the effects of any one of those stressors, like climate, from all of these other stressors. So it's really useful to have long-term data sets in areas like the ELA that don't have all of these other stressors to it. So you can do a better job linking the climate effects to what you see going on in the lakes. So let's jump right to it. It's really clear. This is the data that comes from our meteorological station at the experimental lakes area. We've joint operated this station since 1968. with Environment Canada. And it's incredibly valuable. It's only, a few hundred meters from our main reference lake, and it's within 30 kilometers of all of our other reference lakes. So it is right in the neighborhood of what of the lakes and rivers that we're monitoring. And what the data says is that on average, the annual air temperature is increasing by about 1.5 degrees since 1970, or about 0.3 degrees per decade. So that's much, much faster than the global average. And future projections for the region are at about 1 degree per decade. And I wanted to orientate you a little bit to figures like this. These type of figures are what the IPCC uses as well in their climate reports. And in the top part of the figure, you see every black dot that you see is the mean annual air temperature for any single year. And there's a line that goes across, that's the trend line, and you see it's increasing slightly. Now, it is often really difficult to see, for the human eye to see trends in data like this because it's just so variable. So what the IPCC and others have done is created graphs like the one on the bottom. And this is called an anomaly graph. And basically how it works is if the air temperature for any year is above the long-term average, it's in green and it's above the line. And if any year is below the long-term average, it's in red and it's below the line. And for example, 1970, you can see it's the furthest left on the screen. It was about a little over 1 degree Celsius below the long-term average. And figures like this make it really easy for the human eye to pick up changes that are occurring and potential trends. And so you could see quite clearly that the green bars are towards the right and the red bars are more towards the left. And that is just showing that indeed there is this increase in air temperature that's going on. However, if all you knew about was the mean annual air temperature, you would miss an awful lot. That mean annual air temperature hides a lot of what climate change is doing in terms of its seasonality. So what I've done here is taken that same air temperature data set and we partitioned it into the first 10 years where we collected data, 1970 to 1979 on here, and the last 10 years, 2011 to 2020, and then compared the air temperatures in those decades within different seasons. And on the far left, you see, okay, so there's the change in the mean annual air temperature. Well, it's clear that when you look at the seasons, that annual change is being dominated by what's happening in the wintertime. During the winter months, air temperatures are increasing by about 2.5 degrees over this time period. So much, much faster than the other seasons. And it was statistically significant. Air temperature changes in the autumn were also statistically significant, but not so for the spring and summer. You see that they appear to be increasing, but there is so much variability between years that we're not actually even able to say that there's a statistically significant increase in air temperature. I suspect it will come, but it may take many years before those air temperatures are actually statistical or we can measure them. So it's a very good question saying, well, you know, our lakes are ice covered in the winter. So what does it really matter if the air temperature is warming in the winter and in the fall? Does it matter at all for lakes? And the answer is absolutely yes. And the first thing we're going to talk about right now is its effects on ice cover. And ice cover is a really important event for lakes and rivers. So during the winter, when the lakes freeze over, we have that thick ice cover over the lakes. And typically there's also a lot of snow cover as well. And what that means is there's very little light that's penetrating through the ice into the water below. So, and light is required for photosynthesis, for the growth of plants, of course, and those are what the animals, the invertebrates eat that live in lakes, and of course fish eat those invertebrates. So during the wintertime, lakes are far less productive. And they're also much colder too. Below the ice, the water temperatures are about 4 degrees, and they stay that way until the ice comes off in the spring. And then the lakes, of course, start to warm. Well, we're losing about a little over 4 degrees of ice per decade. And over the period that we've measured ice cover, we've lost about 3 weeks. And this trend is expected to continue on and on. And this has, we're going to talk about the implications to biota, to the things that live in lakes, but it's also really important for us in so many ways. It means we lose EGS, or what's called ecosystem goods and services. And these are the things that our ecosystems provide for us as people. So we're going to see reductions in the length of the snowmobiling season, the ice fishing season, winter roads, and regional economies. Now, in some places like Southern Ontario, there are places where you're just not going to have enough ice cover anymore to undertake some of these activities. And yet, ice fishing and snowmobiling, those pastimes contribute significantly to regional economies. And so this is going to really change the way that communities operate and are able to generate economic activity in many places. Now, here in Northwestern Ontario, we're not talking about the elimination of ice cover, even in the next 25 or more 50 years, but the season is going to get shorter and shorter. And let me see if I can advance the slide here. There we go. And that is really important for many things. And one of them is for ice roads. Many of our northern communities don't have all season roads and may not even have summer roads. And they depend on these ice roads to bring in heavy materials, especially for construction through the wintertime. This is also true on Lake of the Woods, where construction materials are ferried to the many, many islands for cottage maintenance and perhaps building new cottages there. And yet the season is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And the concern that we have is that not only is the ice season getting shorter, but it's also getting more variable. So between the 1969 and 2020, the variability in the duration of ice cover has doubled. And what that means is that it could be frozen over in March of one year, and the next year it melts a month earlier. And then the next year it's back to melting in March again. And so this is a real issue for safety, and habits. If you're used to going out ice fishing at a certain time of year, it just might not be safe to do so anymore. And so there's a real risk to public safety as well. Well, we've talked about air temperatures increasing. What about water temperatures? Well, the answer is absolutely yes. There was this study, global study that was put together in 2015 by Sapna Sharma, who's another Canadian scientist. And lakes, or scientists who work on lakes, contributed from all over the world to supply data for this. And the experimental lakes area did too. And basically, when you look at this map, anywhere that you see a red dot, water temperatures have been increasing. So there's only a few cases in Europe where you see blue dots, and a few towards the Arctic where there's some light blue dots that show water temperatures have been cooling during the midsummer. And even in these cases, they appear to be anomalous. They appear to be affected by these other stressors besides climate. So basically, no matter where you look in the world, water temperatures are increasing. And so there's a question about what that's going to mean. Well, water temperatures are really important for the animals that live in them, because almost all animals that live in our freshwater environments are not mammals. There are some, but most are not. And they cannot regulate their own body temperatures. And what they do is their bodies take on the temperature of the surrounding water. And that's important because water temperature dramatically affects the metabolism of organisms. And you can see, as we move from the winter, the graph at the bottom shows, okay, and that purple line, as water temperature increases, the metabolic rate changes dramatically. And we can see it gets higher and higher and higher through the summer. And you would think that's a good thing. That means they're going to grow faster. Well, that has a downside as well. What it means is essentially that animals have to eat more food just to maintain their body size. And in many lakes, especially those in boreal regions, the food production is not increasing. And so really they have the same amount of food as they've ever had, yet their metabolism is a lot faster. And under these sorts of conditions, what we would expect to see is declines in the size, the growth rates in the size of organisms, and delays to their reproduction as well. And we're going to give an example of that in terms of lake trout using some data that we have at the ELA. So lake trout are one of our sentinel species. They're cold water fish, so they like cooler water temperatures between 6 and 15 degrees Celsius. And the problem is that during the summertime, the surface waters get too warm for them and they have to dive down deeper. So anyone who goes fishing for lake trout knows during the summer you have to, you're not fishing towards the surface, you're fishing much down deeper in the water column. But there's also an issue that lake trout, like other animals, require dissolved oxygen. And naturally occurring in lakes, but even worse in lakes that have algal blooms and lots of organic matter, is that microbial activity that's occurring at the lake sediments consumes oxygen. And so anoxia, or low oxygen conditions, build up over time. And so what happens is lake trout kind of get squeezed into this smaller habitat below the warm water, but above this anoxic water. And that's where they have to live for that summer period. And this is what we refer to as the Goldilocks problem. The top is too hot, the bottom doesn't have enough oxygen, and there's a bit of a squeeze. So in the figure that you're seeing is, I think this was about 10 or 12 lake trout that were tagged with radio transmitters. And so each of the dots is the mean location of those, let's say it's 10 lake trout. And the dashed lines are the 95% confidence intervals. So you see there's some variability about where these lake trout are hanging out, but they're always in these locations where it's not too hot, but there's enough oxygen. And as the summer goes on, you can see that the warm surface layer extends down deeper and deeper into the water column. But also this amount of anoxic water starts building up and increases its height in the water column. So you could imagine as the summer gets longer and longer, that these two, this Goldilocks zone, this optimal habitat for lake trout gets smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point that in some lakes, they're going to overlap and there's going to actually be no optimal habitat for lake trout. And they're going to have to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to hang out in the water that's too warm for me? Or am I going to hang out in the water that has too low oxygen for me? And whichever choice they make is not a good one. And it's going to result, we believe, in reductions in growth rates and reductions in reproduction, delayed reproduction. Well, let's see what's happened. And the issue is this isn't even just something of the future. Over the past 50 years, we've already seen this happen. It doesn't matter what age class we're looking at. They're all getting smaller. And what's shown in that figure, it's called the von Berlaffi growth curve. And it's showing that what the ages are at different, or what sizes they are at different ages. And so that's on the left is the fork length. That's the length of the fish from its nose all the way to the end of its tail. And you can see that over time, that's the different colored lines, the fish are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So it doesn't really matter what age class we're looking at, they're getting smaller. So this is already happening for lake trout. And our concern is that as this goes on into the future, the losses of habitat will become so severe that we're going to start losing lake trout populations, starting with those in our smaller lakes where the habitat is already marginal. Now, I don't think I'm going to show a figure for warm water fish, but the same thing is happening there too, is that warm water fish like perch are getting smaller and smaller as well. And we believe that has to do with these warmer water temperatures, especially during the fall. And it's just hard for them to eat enough food to maintain their body size. Okay, so we've talked so far about climate change, its effects on temperature, and what that means for some of the biota that live in lakes. But as I said earlier, precipitation is a major issue with climate change. And not surprisingly, it's a major issue for lakes and rivers. And this really brings in this concept of watersheds and why what we do on the watersheds really matters. So rain, of course, doesn't just fall on lakes, it falls on the watersheds too. And it flows into streams and overland through wetlands and into our lakes. And it brings with it nutrients and other chemicals that were on the watersheds. So as I said, whatever we do on the watersheds, the rainfall could bring these materials into our lakes. And so I'm going to give an example here about how this interacts with other factors such as land use to changes in nutrient loads and how this relates to climate and why it's just so important. So the example I'm going to have is the Lake Winnipeg ecosystem. And there might be there's similarities I know for sure to Lake Erie, and I expect there are similarities to Lake of the Woods here as well. Now, Lake Winnipeg is a very large watershed. It extends from the Rocky Mountains. It heads down into the US into at least 2 states, and it extends east into Northwestern Ontario. So Lake of the Woods drains into Lake Winnipeg, for example. And the regions to the south and to the east of Lake Winnipeg have been getting more rainfall since the early 1990s. So the question is, what has that done to Lake Winnipeg? So this is a paper that Dave Schindler and colleagues put together back in 2012. And there's a lot going on this figure, but let me help you through it. In the light gray line that has a lot of variability, goes up and down over time, that is the discharge of the Red River. And the Red River is the primary source of phosphorus that enters into Lake Winnipeg. And phosphorus is the primary nutrient that drives algal blooms in lakes. Okay, so there we have discharge, goes up and down every year, but since the 1990s, it has increased and stayed much higher than it has in previous decades. Now, in the darker black line is the phosphorus concentration. And as you see, the phosphorus concentration increased with runoff. And we're getting a lot higher phosphorus concentrations in Lake Winnipeg than we used to. So Dave Schindler and his colleagues here made this very strong connection between these changes in rainfall conditions to changes in discharge, to changes in phosphorus loading, and changes in phosphorus concentration within Lake Winnipeg. Now, what's in the green dots here, and I've placed the green dots on here to make them more visible, but this is what is the phytoplankton biomass. And you can see that even by 2010, we have about 4 times higher algal biomass in the lake than we did during 1970. And this is related to this issue about climate change and runoff. So basically, climate change has exacerbated the way we use the landscape, and it's pushing a lot more phosphorus into the lake, and it's creating these dramatic algal blooms. Well, this has a lot of consequences. So the algal blooms in Lake Winnipeg, they are from both what we call point sources and non-point sources. So they're from urban areas. The phosphorus comes from wastewater treatment plants, but it is also heavily dominated by phosphorus coming from agricultural areas. And that's not surprising. Lake Winnipeg is a very, very large basin, and it's a heavily agricultural basin. So the economic implications of this are staggering. It's to deal with the algal bloom problem on Lake Winnipeg, the city of Winnipeg and the province of Manitoba are upgrading their sewage treatment plants, their wastewater treatment plants at enormous cost. And it's to be able to bring these nutrients down much, much further to deal with this issue. The most recent estimate for a single wastewater treatment facility, the South End treatment plant, or the North End treatment plant, sorry, is $1.8 billion. That's for one wastewater treatment plant. So when you think about this across our provinces and states, the costs of dealing with these issues of algal blooms that are related to climate change are increasing dramatically. So is it getting wetter in our backyard? So this is actually data from the Kenora Meteorological Station, and it was published in a paper by Brian Parker and colleagues in 2009. And what it shows is in the gray squares is snowfall, it's precipitation during the winter. And in the bluish diamonds is rainfall, changes in rainfall. And the first thing is to note is that we're not seeing any increase in snowfall. That has remained pretty static, maybe even just declining a little bit. But what has increased is rainfall. And up until recently, if you look in the early part of the data set, it appeared cyclic at about a 31-year cycle. So it would get wet and then it'd get dry, it'd get wet again, it'd go up and down in this cycle. But since the early 1990s, it has got wet and stayed wet. So we should be going through a drought period, and we should have been going through a drought period for the past 10 years, but we haven't. It's stayed remarkably wet. We've been getting much more rainfall than we have in the past. And there's a significant trend in rainfall upwards in our region. So we talked about in watersheds that have a lot of agriculture, and the implications there are increases in nutrient loads and potentially contaminant loads too. But in pristine boreal areas, it's not phosphorus loads or nitrogen loads that are really the issue. It's loads of what we call dissolved organic carbon. And essentially, you may notice if you go to a lake, some lakes are really brown in color and they're dark, where other lakes are crystal clear and it looks like you're on a coral reef. Well, the brown color that you see in some lakes is this dissolved organic carbon. And essentially, it is leachate from soils and wetlands that contains a lot of organic material in it. So not surprising when we get a little more rainfall and more discharge, it is running through these soils and running through these wetlands and bringing more of this dissolved organic carbon into our lakes. And you can see the figures on the left are data for the 50 years that show how does changes in rainfall relate to how much dissolved organic carbon enters into lakes. And it's a very strong relationships in all cases. And the magnitude, you'll note that on the y-axis, the vertical axis, the scales are different between the three streams. That's because it really just depends on the watershed size. The bigger the watersheds, the more dissolved organic carbon you get loaded into them. And then there's some other effects of how much wetlands that you have in them and where those wetlands are located. If they're located closer to the lake, you tend to get more dissolved organic carbon. And if they're located higher up in the catchments, they're not always connected to the streams. And so they maybe matter a little bit less. But nonetheless, more rainfall, more dissolved organic carbon loading. So why is this important? Well, it is important for things like CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. So this was a study by Hall et al., Britt Hall et al. And colleagues, and myself included, and a number of folks from the experimental lakes area that examined what happens when we load more dissolved organic carbon into lakes. What does that mean for greenhouse gas emissions? What does that mean for carbon budgets? And essentially, CO2 effluxes from our boreal lakes represent about 16 to 20% of the inputs. So the more input we get, the more CO2 we have going to the atmosphere. So this means lakes in our region, if rainfall keeps continuing to go up, are going to be emitting more CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's the bad news. There is actually some good news associated with this too is that not all of that carbon goes to the atmosphere, and a lot of it actually goes to sedimentation. So, that's what we've referred to as permanent burial. So about the same percentage, 16 to 20% goes to permanent burial as well. So, and where that's important is over much, much longer timeframes. So on shorter timeframes, this emission of CO2 in the atmosphere is really is going to be a big issue for our ability to bring down global CO2 concentrations. But in the long term, more rainfall, and we're talking over centuries, means we're getting more carbon buried in our sediments. Well, there's more to this story, and it is about how does dissolved organic carbon influence lake ecosystems? And it turns out it influences them dramatically. The top picture that you see of these different glasses is there for visual purposes. And you can imagine a lake that, like the glass on the left, that's really clear. And then there's a glass on the right that has really high DOC concentrations and it's really opaque. And the point that is trying to be made by this picture is that dissolved organic carbon has strong attenuating properties over light. And so the more dissolved organic carbon you have in a lake, the less light can penetrate down into the water column of these lakes. So it's absorbed at shallower and shallower depths. In the figure below, we're going to actually quantify how much that matters. And you can see on the x-axis here is dissolved organic carbon, and on the y-axis is depth. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the photic depth. This is basically the 1% light level, or the amount of light that is required for plants to grow. And remember that plants are the base of aquatic food webs. And so in a lake that has very, very low dissolved organic carbon, 3 or 4 milligrams per liter, light can extend down to about 20 meters below the surface, and plants can grow down to that depth. However, as you slide along this figure to lakes that have much, much higher dissolved organic carbon concentrations, light can only penetrate down to about 5 meters. And so plants cannot grow nearly as far down, and their habitat is cut by about 3/4. So you can imagine a lot less food production in lakes that have very high DOC concentrations. The other thing that happens is the thermocline depth. Now, the thermocline is that transition from the warm upper surface layer, where the sun is heating up the water, and the colder water that's below. And it's a very abrupt transition. And for anyone who's done any scuba diving before, or maybe even been able to snorkel or dive down several meters into the water, you can put your hand through the thermocline, and your body could be in the warm water, but as you stick your hand through, your hand gets very, very cold. So the thermocline is this very, very abrupt transition. And we see with dissolved organic carbon that it's getting shallower as well. By about half. So in lakes with low dissolved organic carbon, the thermocline can be down to about 10 meters, but in lakes that have high dissolved organic carbon, the thermocline is at about 5 meters. So it has big effects on the thermocline, it has big effects on the photic depth. Well, what about biota? As I mentioned, light is the primary requirement for photosynthesis. If you don't have light, you can't photosynthesize. And that is the base of aquatic food webs. So reductions in light associated with lake browning are leading to reductions in the growth of algae. And that's in that top figure that you see there. In fact, this is from a thesis that was recently published by a student of mine named Brianna Sherbo. And what she found is when you look across these lakes with gradients of DOC, lakes with high DOC have about almost 80% less primary production or algal growth occurring in them than in lakes with really low DOC. So basically, this reductions in light are really restricting the habitat for plants and the amount that they can grow. And when you think about it, this will likely have cascading impacts through the food web. And the figure at the bottom shows the results of another student who was on the same project. His name was Joseph Tonin. And this is from his master's thesis. And basically he's showing that because of this decline in plant growth, that zooplankton, or these are the bugs that live in the water that fish eat, their biomass has decreased significantly across this DOC gradient as well. And again, by at least 80%. So the research is ongoing to try to understand the effects that this is having on fish, but it appears to be reducing the growth rates of fish and also changing the types of fish that are able to survive in these types of environments. But there's more work on that. So that is ongoing, and hopefully we can present that in the future. So just to summarize, climate change is making lakes more sensitive to land use in their watersheds. So it's exacerbating problems that we've already had and making them more sensitive. It just means we have to pay a lot more attention to how we use our lands in our watersheds. Importantly, for areas that are going to receive more rainfall, such as our areas, we need to think about ways to keep water on the landscape, whether that be ensuring that we don't pave over any more wetlands to trying to promoting new wetlands, or other ways that we can keep water on the landscape and not increasing the rate at which it gets to our streams and rivers. This will allow the water to percolate into the soils, and with it, the phosphorus and other nutrients. Of course, in boreal watersheds, the issues are not primarily nutrients. They are dissolved organic carbon. And this is a relatively new area of study. Maybe in the last 10 years or so, folks started to focus on these impacts. But they're painting a story about, like I said, reduced primary production, reduced secondary production, and reduced production of fisheries. And I wanted to finish off by saying that there are some things that are slow moving and are trending. But there are some events that are episodic just by their very nature, and fire is one of them. Now, fire is an important and natural component of boreal ecosystems. And often forest fires can be very, very intense and burning vegetation and even the soils that are below the trees. There are certainly implications to human safety, to our cities, to our infrastructure, but there's also implications to our lakes and rivers too. It is a challenging aspect to study because fires are so episodic, and because we often don't have baseline data where these fires occur. However, there was a major forest fire at the Experimental Lakes area in 1980 that burnt the watersheds around some of our reference lakes. And the fire was so intense that it burnt away much of the soil, especially in the upland areas. And that's that picture you see at the bottom. Bare bedrock was exposed. There was really just no soils left. And this has the potential to affect the water yields. So surprisingly enough, when rainfall falls on our watersheds, about 70% of that is evapotranspirated, meaning only 30% of the water that falls in a watershed makes it to the lake. The rest goes back up into trees, into vegetation, and eventually is respired back to the atmosphere, or transpired, I should say. But of course, that's not the case if you don't have any vegetation or soils. And so you get more runoff, more susceptibility to floods. And these issues can persist for many, many years. You can imagine in the figure, or the picture below, that it took decades for these forests to regenerate. And even so, at ELA, where we are, the forests are still in a period of regeneration. And this was, 40 years after the fire. So it's a major issue. And the final point I wanted to make was, we started off this presentation talking about trends and projections. And through the presentation, we've been talking about the trends, the things that have been happening in the past. But it's important to know that the future is not just an extension of the past, and that the projections that are in place for the future actually diverge quite a bit from our historical trends. And so we're heading into a new climate envelope. And what you see by the line that I just put up on the screen, this is what the climate projections say where we're heading by even 2050 or 2070, is that the summer air temperatures are going to increase dramatically. This potentially means much higher risks for forest fires. These areas are going to dry out much, much faster than they have in the past. Even if we have more rainfall, they'll dry out incredibly quickly. And the other thing that it means is that we really need to develop strong relationships between and mechanistic relationships between what's going on in the lakes, the biota, and the climate projections. And some of the best ways to do this is through a whole ecosystem experimentation and through the evaluation of the monitoring data like I've been discussing today. And I just want to finish off by saying thank you and to acknowledge that the experimental lakes area is on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Nation and Treaty 3 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I want to thank these groups for their partnerships that we have been engaging with them since IISD took over the experimental lakes area in 2014. And this relationship is building, and it is, to me, quite wonderful. And I want to thank the First Nations groups involved and say how much that we appreciate it at the ELA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. What a great presentation, and so neat to hear information that's right here in our backyard. So thank you so much. I'm just looking at the Q&A, and we do have a couple of questions. The first one is from an anonymous attendee, and the question, Scott, is, beside changes in rainfall, what about changes in the Red River watershed, like tiling of farm fields?
That is a really good question. Agriculture, the tiling is quite prominent in places like Southern Ontario. It hasn't been as prominent in the West as it has been out East, but it's getting more and more prominent. And there's a couple of issues. I think one of the things about the tiling is it can be done really well, and it can be done poorly. One of the big problems with the tiling is that essentially it's a way for farmers to get the water off their fields faster so that they can plant earlier and they can get an earlier harvest. But the problem is, by getting that water off faster, it gets into our streams faster. It is carrying that phosphorus with it, and it's getting into Lake Winnipeg faster. This creates issues for nutrient loads, but it also creates issues for flooding too. And so really what we need to do is to hold water back on the landscape. And there are ways to do that with tiling, actually. And so you can connect the tiling to closed drainage ditches or ponds, or even to pump them up into structures. And there's a benefit of doing that, in that you do that in the spring when the water's high and you're getting it off your field. And then when the summer comes and it starts to dry out, you can actually pump the water back through your tiling system and irrigate your crops from the bottom, which reduces evaporation losses as well. So it could be a net benefit. So I think the question is how we deal with tiling. I think it's an issue, and other things that we've been doing on the landscape, like confined animal farms, are an issue. And it's an issue we're going to need to pay closer and closer attention to as rainfall patterns continue to stay elevated like they are.
Thank you. I see there's a question here from Arthur Friesen. Would you like to unmute, Arthur, and ask your question?
Okay, sure. Hi, yeah, my name's Arthur Friesen. You made the connection between precipitation and dissolved organic carbon. What about, is there a connection between nutrient levels and CO2 emissions?
So Arthur, do you mean nutrient levels in our lakes?
Yes. nutrient loads and CO2 emissions?
Okay, well, there's two ways to look at this. So and this is, I believe it's incorrect, although some people have proposed that increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere will actually lead to higher CO2 concentrations in lakes and higher productivity in our lakes. And that's actually not true. And that's especially not true in boreal regions because our lakes are what we call supersaturated in CO2. So they're above the equilibrium constant and CO2 is constantly coming out of lakes. And that's because dissolved organic carbon is coming into the lakes, bacteria are breaking them down, producing CO2, and that CO2 is evading out into the atmosphere. So in terms of that aspect, there's going to be no increase in lake productivity as a result of CO2. However, there is a relationship, and I wonder if this is maybe more of where you were going with this question. As you add nutrients to lakes, you get larger algal blooms. And algal blooms can obviously, they are fixing carbon and they're drawing down carbon concentrations in the lake. And a lot of that organic material, that algae that's being produced, sinks to the bottom and is permanently buried. So actually lakes that are eutrophic or lakes that have larger algal blooms increase the sedimentation rate and the carbon burial rate. So they actually overall reduce the amount of carbon going to the atmosphere.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Scott, there's another comment here from another anonymous attendee. It says the DOC also brings with it mercury and nutrients. So we can have climate-induced eutrophication due to increased nutrients, not accounting for decreased photic depth or increased water temperature.
Yeah, whoever you are, anonymous attendee, I have to say our minds are very along the same route. That study that I was talking about by those two students, Brianna Sherbo and Joseph Tonin, this was actually the idea that we started with in saying, well, we know that dissolved organic carbon reduces the light in lakes, and that would likely have an effect over plant growth. But we knew that it also brought in nutrients. And it isn't just, even though we call it dissolved organic carbon, a better word's probably dissolved organic matter because it comes with it with nitrogen and phosphorus and a lot of other elements, as you point out. And so we thought that actually, because these boreal lakes that we're looking at are very pristine and they're strongly nutrient limited, especially for phosphorus. And we've run whole ecosystem experiments where if we add a little bit of phosphorus, we get large increases in algal growth. However, what we saw across this gradient of lakes with changes in dissolved organic carbon, we saw that in this balance between nutrients and light, it's actually light that seems to dominate. And that is that the reductions in light seem to overwhelm these small increases of nutrients that we get. Now, so that's what we saw in these are pristine lakes and pristine watersheds. In unpristine watersheds, the addition of nutrients is significant. And I used Lake Winnipeg as an example, but there's also lakes, even in the Kenora area, where there was a major rainfall, I think it was 2 years ago that happened, a major rainfall event that happened that caused a lot of overland flow into lakes. And in areas that had never had algal blooms before, had significant algal blooms. And so here, this is this connectivity where it could be lawns that we had fertilizers on. It could be ponds that were nutrient rich that were away from the lake that were now connected to the lake. But your point is right. More rainfall means more nutrients as well. And it's not just DOC. Yeah, so very good question.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Johan Strub. Would you like to unmute and ask, Johan?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I guess, great presentation. Thank you so much. I was wondering about the impact of climate change on water levels. Like, I think in the chat asked specifically about flooding, but but also perhaps more generally water levels throughout the year. If you, yeah, like I guess if you thought about the impact both on the lakes and on communities.
Yeah, so I think the general answer is yes, there's a real concern about flooding. And I can give some very practical examples of this. Certainly in the spring, there's this issue, and a lot of it depends on the snowpack of over the previous winter. That hasn't changed a lot, but what does change is not always just how much snow there is, but how fast it melts, right? So if there's a very rapid transition above 0 degrees Celsius and the snow melts very rapidly, there can be very big issues with runoff. And that's happened in the Lake Winnipeg Basin. That's a major issue every year. Everyone's always really concerned about flooding. But it's not just the spring runoff. There's also one of the concerns about climate change is that it's increasing the intensity of storms. So we may have the same or even less precipitation events, but the events that we do have much more rain associated with them. This happened to us in, I believe it was 2019, where we had the largest rainfall on record for a single event. And it overflowed our inflow. We have weirs that we monitor the stream flow. It overwhelmed those weirs. It was intense, and it raised the water levels up about a foot in these lakes, and that's quite impressive. And it takes a long time for these lakes to drain. Now we're in a pretty remote area where there's not a lot of infrastructure around the shorelines, but in areas that do have a lot of infrastructure, cottages or developments, this is a major issue and a very costly issue as well. So yes, there's a real concern that both changes in spring precipitation events and changes in these episodic events could cause some real issues with flooding. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from David Malahar. Would you like to go ahead, David?
Thank you. Is my audio on?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Scott. That was a most interesting presentation. I've been a fan of the ELA since the beginning, and I still am. Thank you. In your presentation where you got to Lake Winnipeg, you were showing a chart. One of them was the phosphorus, or that the Red River is a major delivery of phosphorus into Lake Winnipeg. As I looked at the chart, it seemed that most of the increase occurred in a 10-year period between 1990 and 2000. Is there any significance to this? Is this something that phosphorus likes to do, or any explanation?
Yeah, so I've spoken with the authors of that report, and one, it's a fascinating report. And one of the things that, we often talk about the way we use the land. So land use is the primary determinant to phosphorus concentration in the streams, like the Red River, and how much flows into Lake Winnipeg. But what the authors of this report found was that the concentration stayed remarkably the same over time, and that it was discharge that was really dominating the calculation of the load. So you can imagine discharge times phosphorus equals how much loading you're getting to the lake. And it is that discharge component of the equation that completely dominated. But you are right to point out that the major step change occurred in the 1990 to 2000 period. We see this at ELA as well. That was the period where rainfall increased dramatically, but then has basically stayed up at that high level. It just hasn't come back down. So it's not that rainfall is on this really steep slope of increasing over time. It's more that it's increased in the 90s. It's remained relatively stable. And the projections are that it should kind of stay that high is the projections that I've seen.
But stay that high would, I suppose, be better than keep on climbing. How do we fit this all together?
Yeah, well, this is the real challenge, is that the projections for precipitation there's just so much uncertainty associated with them. And so it's really challenging to deal with. And there's still a lot of variability. Like this year, for example, We had kind of a rainy spring, but we didn't have a single rainfall for mid-June all the way till towards the end of August. Very, very dry summer. But then it got wet again. And so the seasonality is important to this too. But your point is well taken. We found the exact same thing at the ELA about this kind of step change, that it's just stayed high. Even though we should be in a drought period, we really haven't been. We've just stayed at this high level.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, we have another entry here from an anonymous attendee. Is it possible that as water temperatures warm, increased DOC in boreal lakes will balance out with an increase of productivity from warmer temperatures, for example, curbing algal blooms, especially in lakes with more development influencing nutrient loads?
Right. So a lot here depends on, there's two parts. One is the watershed, and two is the size of the lake as well. Because I didn't have time to really get into it, but for example, the size of the lake is really important because it affects what is known as the residence time. So the residence time means how long does an average molecule of water stay in that lake after it comes in through rain or through an inflow. And lakes with really long residence time, say 20 years or longer, and Lake of the Woods would absolutely fit in this. They have a lot of time to process that material that comes in, like dissolved organic carbon. So really big lakes, you don't actually even expect to see large increases in DOC. But more nutrients that comes in means more algae for sure. Lake temperatures, as air temperature increases and water temperatures increase, we do expect to see an increase in primary production. So here, where it depends on is really how much nutrients are in that lake. So in lakes like at the ELA, these are very nutrient poor lakes. So even though it's warmer, these algae are going to run out of nutrients very, very quickly. And we will see a slight increase in algal growth, but not a lot. Lakes like Lake of the Woods, which have higher nutrient concentrations, are at a much higher risk of this. And Lake Winnipeg's along in the same basket. So as water temperatures increase, there is a concern that algal blooms will increase as well, or the duration and the magnitude.
Thank you. I just want to remind people that if you don't want to type into the Q&A, you can certainly raise your hand. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. Just wait another couple of minutes. Oh, I see that Todd has his hand raised.
Hi, Scott, and thank you for your presentation. I just want to follow up on the cyclical nature of the precipitation record, and that the documentation that we're in a quite an extended wet period. Although if you look at the last summer, we might wonder about that. And particularly in terms of the comments about brownification. And, if you go back a couple of decades, Dave Schindler's 1990 paper talked about a different trend. Lower DOC and increased photic zones based on the decades leading up to 1990. And maybe I just wondered if you had some comment on timescales here in terms of what we're looking at, or whether you think we're really in sort of some shift to some sort of change or loss of stationarity in our ability to predict the past from the future, or the future from the past.
Yeah, so I think you've alluded to Brian Parker's paper. And that paper, they showed they used the Kenora data because the meteorological data, because it has a longer time series even than the ELA. And he was able to identify a 31-year periodicity to rainfall. Essentially, the early 1970s was a wet period. It led into the 1980s that got quite dry. And then, and that was the period that Dave Schindler wrote that paper. That was the data that he used from the 70s into about 1990, I think, maybe just after. And so they were talking about this drying period. But of course, that periodicity led to, and it was right on track in the early 1990s, an increase in rainfall, as we would expect. But what happened after that was not expected. And according to that periodicity, we would have expected rainfall to decline dramatically. And for us to be in a drought period, as early as 2005 to 2010, and we never entered into it. Just stayed rainy. Now it's variable from year to year, for sure, but overall it stayed quite high. So I've been trying to track down climate scientists to talk to try to understand why this occurred, and if it's the major weather patterns that sit over top of us in the atmosphere, if they've somehow shifted, and if they're not oscillating in the same way over these long time periods like they used to, and are we in this new normal now, and is this where we're going to stay, or like you say, should we expect to see some declines? So far, I think there's so much uncertainty that nobody wants to be on the record for saying, this is exactly how it's going to go. But I take your point. There's a lot of variability in precipitation, and there's a lot of uncertainty in it. But it matters a lot. It matters for Lake of the Woods and nutrient loads. It matters for these boreal lakes in terms of DOC loads. And so, yeah, it's a real issue. I wish I had a better answer to your question than that, but I think that's where it's at right now.
Well, thank you, Scott. I certainly don't expect you to have a crystal ball. I mean, and certainly we see that variability in nutrient loading to Lake of the Woods very clearly tied to the episodic precipitation events.
Yeah, but maybe one of the things I'll say, Todd, is so even though the precipitation, the loading are really highly variable, I think for Lake of the Woods and Lake Winnipeg and other places, the problem is once that phosphorus comes in, it has the chance to be recycled for many years after that. And so the lake actually has less variability than the loads do. The variability doesn't always help us. So even if we have a low precipitation year, we're still dealing with the phosphorus that came in last year. So, it's a real issue.
Good, thank you.
Are there any final questions? All right. Well, I am not seeing any hands up, so I'm going to assume that you've answered everyone's burning questions, Dr. Higgins. So thank you. On behalf of the foundation, I would really like to thank you for this presentation. It was fascinating and lots of wonderful questions as well. So thank you to the participants. I know that always makes the job of the presenter that much better when they have great questions come at them. So thank you to all. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you if you joined us over the course of the series. We were very pleased to offer this, and we thank all of our presenters. I think we have such high quality researchers, scientists, and amazing presenters at our fingertips in this basin, and we're very lucky. So we thank all of them, and especially Dr. Higgins for today. So thank you. For those of you who would like to watch the recording of this presentation or any of the presentations, they all will be up on the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation's website. This one, just wait a day or two, but the other ones should be up. Certainly, if you know of someone who missed it, pass the link on. And I just really want to thank you again, Dr. Higgins, for all of the information you gave to us today. It was really fascinating. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Hi, Scott. You still there, Scott? Oh, you're on mute.
Still here.
Why do we still have an attendee showing up with no name? Huh. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you a question, if you got 1 minute.
Yep.
It's about residence times. So Catherine Hargan, in her thesis at Trent, to look at the preliminary nutrient budget for Lake of the Woods, with Peter Dillon, work that we supported, based on, rough ins and outs and evaporation, etc. She calculated a residence time of about 7 years. Environment Canada's model, from their model, they say it's 1 year or less.
Wow.
And I've never been able to get any reconciliation of this that makes sense to me. If you got any insights on, one of these days I'm going to get all the control board discharge data and figure it out back of the envelope. And there's Terry Reese. Hi, Terry. Terry.
Hello.
How are you doing? It's Terry Reese from FOCA.
How are you doing?
Good.
Sorry, I got caught in another meeting about Phragmites, which was equally interesting.
Well, we're just about to sign off, and I was asking Scott a post-webinar question about residence times. Anyway, Scott, have you got any insight into that? I mean, short of getting the control board data and looking at even at the maximum discharge, of 10,000, was it 13,000 cubic meters per second across the Norman Dam? I mean, there's different definitions of residence time.
Well,
a year or less just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
No, it's outflow. It's outflow divided by lake volume. So there's only a couple, but so there, we'll often, like, I'm sure, and it's really a question of the methods, I guess, they used in the data, because I don't know if Catherine just produced a static residence time based on low flow. Maybe, but like, that's a big difference. There's only two things. If the lake volume is identical between the two, like, I can't see how they'd be that far off in lake volume. So my guess is the estimates of outflow were what was dramatically changing. I suspect the modeling is probably better, and it's current. Based on these high flows that we've been getting, but still, that's a big difference. I suspect there's something methodological. Yeah. Yeah,
and the best I could get out of RAM at ECCC was, well, the model, of course, it's a box model, and they've just, from what I got out of them, it sounds like they've summed the transfer times between their 3 meter boxes or whatever it is in the model, and they've come out with less than a year. I don't know. One of these days, I'm just going to do the discharge data myself, because it just doesn't make sense to me.
It's possible, but I find it hard to believe it's less than a year. But there is a way to do it. Okay, so what I wonder, Well, in stratified lakes, there's an issue, and I remember I talked to Mike Patterson about this. I was just talking to you about the other day, because
you could have a laminar flow, right?
That's right. If you're just talking the epi, like after it's stratified, the volume's a lot less in the epi, and so yes, you can get flow through just straight across the epi. But Lake of the Woods, it's pretty well mixed, right? So
that's right.
I don't know how, like, that doesn't seem to be an issue for Lake of the Woods.
Okay, so you're just confirming that I'm not crazy to be still worried about.
It should be an easy calculation. I mean, if you have the annual discharge data, you just divide that by lake volume, and that's your estimate of residence time. So it's not a complex calculation.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So Terry, what's going on?
I'm still waiting on the minister so I can go solve your problem about not getting any attention from the province.
Yeah.
But that's about it. Sorry, I missed the talk. I'm sure it was fascinating, and I'll look forward to.
Well, you can replay it the next day or two on our website.
Excellent.
It was really good, Terry. You'll enjoy it. And hi, by the way.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Scott. And sorry for the after action question, but it's just been bugging me. When you mentioned residence time, I had to sit up and go like, okay, this is back on my it's bugging me list.
Yeah, no problem. Well, it was a real pleasure. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Todd. Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Anytime. And nice to meet you, Terry.
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Bye.
Okay.
Bye,
everyone.
Scott.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.